Thank you, Admiral, for your friendship to the State of Israel, for the sharing of values, and for the sharing of the strategic agreement. Your warm words are morale boosting for all of us sitting in this tent. כעת אני מקווה שלכולכם הייתה הזדמנות בתקופה של הכנס להתבונן בחידושים במרכז הבינתחומי ובשינוי הנוף יחסית לשנה שעברה, ואני שמח להזמין את הנשיא המייסד והמוציא לפועל של כל השינויים שראיתם כאן ושל ה-Fair Deal גם שהוא קיבל מבנט לדוקטורטים ולאוניברסיטה פרטית. פרופסור אוריאל רייכמן, תשואות לפרופסור אוריאל רייכמן, הנשיא והמייסד.
פרופסור אוריאל רייכמן.
שלום לכולם.
Hello everybody.
ערב טוב.
Good evening.
אני רוצה לקדם בברכה
I'd like to welcome
את רב אלוף מילואים גדי איזנקוט,
Lieutenant
נכנס
General Gadi
למחזור
Eidenschott,
הראשון של
who was
דוקטורי
in
כבוד
the
במרכז
first
הבינתחומי,
class
ופותח
of
את
Dr.
הסדרה.
Honoris Causa
אני,
in the IDC,
הדבר מבטא הערכה
and that
גדולה
of
מאוד
course reflects a great
לפועלו
appreciation to
ולתרומתו
his activities,
למדינת ישראל.
to his
תודה לך
contribution to the
שבאת.
state of Israel, and I thank
אני
you for coming.
רוצה גם
I'd like
לשוב
also
ולציין
to
את אלוף מילואים
mention
עמוס גלעד,
General in Reserves Amos Gilead. He really gave us a fantastic
תוך כדי
conference
באמת עבודה
while working in quite hard conditions, while taking advantage of the encouragement he gets from the entire world. Thank you wholeheartedly.
חוסנה של מדינת ישראל
The resilience of the state of Israel compels us to have some basic agreements as a sine qua non to have a resilience that will insist and resist all the problems that we have today. And we had such a basis, and that was the Scroll of Independence, the Declaration of the State. This was a groundbreaking document, and it was neutralized by the national law because of the surrender to the Haredi. And that surrender opened the gate, and it integrates together with the dangerous trend of changes in legislation and constitution that might jeopardize Israeli democracy and shock the basis of national agreement. And it's important that we deal with this subject very seriously without being dragged to rhetorics of elections. Following the UN resolution that they recognized the Jewish state, now the Muslims are declaring the Holy Grail, and the next day all the armies of the Arab countries joined the war against us, and on that day in 1948 there was the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. The declaration at the time was the national credo that followed the combatants in this vicious war. Had we been defeated, this might have been the end of the Jewish people. After the Holocaust, it would have been, in fact, the last battle. The Declaration of Independence does not reflect only a liberation war. This was the second document in its importance in the history of the Jewish people after the Ten Commandments. The caste of Jewish slaves was organized in Egypt by Moses, who led them to rebel against their fate and take them to the land of their forefathers. The Zionist revolution, led by Herzl, did the unbelievable, the unprecedented in our history,
when it led very persecuted people with bloodshed throughout the 2,000 years of exile and brought it back to its historical homeland. Some of the people there rebelled. They wanted to go back to the reality of slavery in Egypt, but the Zionist movement also had the opposition of Haredi movement who helped for the help of God in order to regain redemption. The Declaration of Independence reflects the values of Zionism. The movement was born out of the Enlightenment movement, and it enabled a breakthrough into the elite of the Western society, and together with the exposure to Enlightenment, and many people rebelled against the totality of the halakha and the rabbis, but they continued to see themselves as members of the Jewish people, faithful to a historical past, culture, and values. For them, the main bulk of Judaism was the national identity, faithfulness to Hebrew, to the state, to human values and traditions. Their perception of Jews as a nation was in the basis of national activism that both practically and diplomatically brought back people to settle this country and national recognition. And following the Zionist doctrine, the Declaration of Independence reflects the fact that we want to be a free people in our country, equality to all. The Declaration of Independence reflects the striving to an exemplary society and also to the basic principles that we all know that are in the Declaration. The State of Israel is going to be open for Jewish aliyah and gathering of the exiles, developing the country for the benefit of all its citizens, based on the principles of liberty and justice in the vision of the prophets, and have complete equality for all its citizens without any difference of religion, creed, gender, and it will be the education and culture and also maintain the holy sites. The declaration about the establishment of the Jewish state includes the values of this country, and the declaration was signed by the representatives of all the parties in Israel. The values were perceived as valid, and the declaration about the mere fact of the establishment of the state. To the law of creating the country, there were a few bills that were submitted at the time, and all of them had the determination that the State of Israel is the national state of the Jewish people. There were the basic sovereignties of the Jewish people, and it was explicitly bound by the principles. I thought that the law was superfluous, but we could have seen in those bills of the national law strengthening to the Declaration of the Independence. But the last minute, towards the vote, out of that law was deleted any relation to the Declaration of Independence. The national law, as a law, became a law, whereas the declaration was just sitting there without any legal status. The Declaration of Independence, that was a basis for national agreement, was deleted from its role, and it became just a museum object. And the difficulty of that was that the basic law that defines the essence of the national state of the Jewish people adopts only the symbolic side of the state, but ignores the essence, the values, the moral of the country. And so there is no real supervision on any violation of the principles of the declaration, and only the national message was left. So what happened, actually? In the very short time between the bill of the national law and its enactment, the facts are not disputable. In order to pass the law by 61 majority, the Likud went to the Haredi parties, and their agreement was conditioned in deleting the relation to the Declaration of Independence. Who did this serve? What about this deletion? Who did it serve? The deletion of the scroll. First of all, the Haredi party, they are reserved from the declaration because it doesn't say that the regime of the State of Israel will be based on the Torah laws and all the religious elements in the life. It also against the fact that it doesn't actually mention the name of God Almighty. By deleting that, this is a victory of the perception of the Haredi world. Although the national law does not give back the dominance to the Haredi world, but it does delete its free and liberal and equality nature. And we saw the reservation of the Haredi historically to the state and to the Zionist movement. Another group that definitely benefits from that deletion is the Messianic Jews. These people, together with the rabbis who sit on the seam line, is trying to undermine the Zionist narrative by creating another narrative. The return to Zion is a religious phenomenon. It was not obtained by the narrative that I said, the Zionist one. As opposed to the Haredi, who see in Zionism a secular phenomenon, and the Messianic think it's the act of God. Whether they see the Zionists as heretics and the faith in the national religion, that won. And in the final version of the national law, there's a determination that the Jewish people is eligible to define itself as a religious country. And after the enactment of the law, not surprisingly, the MK Smotrich saw himself, justifiably so, as justified to ask to perform here a halachic state. And apparently the law does not negate such a step. Now we have to ask, how come the Prime Minister agreed? And I have appreciation to him because of his political achievements and all the others. So how come? How did he agree to pass the law without mentioning the principles of the declaration? But apparently the Prime Minister saw importance to pass the national law in this way, and this way he could have appeared in the elections when the Likud represents the national camp and the left did not. And this succeeded in the media. But the absurdity is that agreeing with the camp that is against the Zionism was presented as a national step, whereas those who supported the scroll of the independence were defined as objectors. Of course, the Prime Minister understood that, but had he been a responsible leader, he would try to look for a consensus beyond the narrow political interest when we talk about the definition of a national state. This is a manipulation, hypocrisy. Similar question. A similar question has to be addressed to the former Minister of Justice, Ayelet Shaked. On the 29th of August 2017, in the conference of opening the conference of the bar, she said, and I quote, "My wish is to see Israel as a strong national state, and together with that, giving all the rights of individuals that it compels itself to in the scroll of independence, which is the groundbreaking document for everybody, Jews, Muslims, Druze, Christians." And because of this duty, she continued to say, the minister, there isn't and cannot be a political controversy. The bill of the national law that Ayelet Shaked submitted together with Yariv Levin and others did include the referral to the scroll of independence. So how come it disappeared? What happened? How come the support of Ayelet Shaked drove to the deletion of that most important document of our nation? How did it disappear? One has to say the truth. Bad spirit has been now hovering above us, one that changes the values of the State of Israel. The nation law, I would say blatantly, detached itself from the national credo on which our illustrious Zionist past was built. We are now going in the wrong direction. Democracies die slowly. This process is usually on waves of nationalisms and religious radicalism. Turkey, Poland, Hungary are preceding us. We're still not there. However, we are already marching towards their path. The most significant beginning in those countries was the perception of the majority in the parliament or the Knesset, and that is the real essence of democracy. This will, in their perception, compels all the authorities of the country. And therefore, in these countries, they decided to go against anybody who dares to object against anything that they call the will of the people, because it disturbs, so to speak, to the government to rule. And actually what happened in these three countries, jeopardizing the courts, the constitution, and even controlling them, because the leadership of doing away with the gatekeepers, but using the police and the Shabak and the Mossad, and of course replacing the military commanders. The public media became as a propaganda tool for the government, and regulation systems are supposed to guard what they call the national freedom of speech. Organizations and NGOs and study organizations became part of the control of the government, and they rule the monies that come to these organizations. In Hungary, the new constitution says that on the shoulders of the state is the duty to defend the Christian culture of Hungary. In Poland, all the rules of elections were based in order to win over the democracies. It's important to mention that all these changes and everything that happened in these countries came step after step from all the legitimate so-called constitution. This development sounds very familiar, because now we feel the same thing here, and we have to tell the truth. Without any checks and balances, we and our children are going to live in a different world, a world without freedom, a world of imposition. The state of Israel will not be an exemplary state and will not reflect the dream that we dreamed all our lives. In Israel, too, they preach to the public that the laws of the Knesset are the will of the people. And in the coalition method, the Knesset doesn't determine anything. It just does what the government tells it. And the government is controlled many times by a minority group, sometimes very radical, of ministers. And here in Israel, apparently even the majority needs defense. We should look into the rhetorics of the government now and the changing reality. And we'll say a few words about the national religious connection. Here we attack the High Court of Appeal that it's not good enough. They say that it shouldn't have any authority to disqualify rules of the Knesset and to give power to the government not to respect the decisions of the court if they look too radical. Some people demand that there'll be a clause of overriding in a majority of 61 MKs. There's a system of delegitimation of the gatekeepers, the police, the Attorney General, and all sorts of bills to change the way to elect the judges and to reduce their power and to put borders. We went through legislation to limit the rights of the people. The government already managed to control the public media, and we already experienced the reality of cultural commissars. Where does it come, all these things, to us? Some of it derives from jeopardizing the principle that legislation is not there in order to advance personal advancement. Such legislation, they said, should come because of the campaign to exonerate the Prime Minister. But in the deeper sense, the Haredi intentions came up. Even a great rabbi like Ovadia Yosef, he was considered moderate in the past. He blatantly went against the Supreme Court because he said at the time that the Supreme Court is not an elected, they know nothing about the Jewish history, and he's going to give us all the disasters of the world. There's also a movement of the autonomy of the Haredi Ashkenazi community, and they want civil justice. And then the Messianic movement also warms the engines of that doctrine. According to the Haredi world, democracy is only majority rule. They will accept the majority rule so that controversies will go to the benefit of the public. They do not accept any judicial, constitutional justice. They say that in justice there's only one thing for Israel, and that is the rules of the Torah. And this opinion today is adopted by activists in order to make coalitions and trade in votes. When the Minister Deri's appeal was rejected, some of his supporters tried to actually break into the Supreme Court. And after that, there was a huge demonstration of tens of thousands of Haredi near the courts. At the time, I was afraid that there's going to be another breakthrough, that 7,000 people with convening in Jerusalem. And I said to the people, if they're going to break into the Supreme Court, we are going to defend it with our bodies. The Haredi just were standing there and praying. But we also folded our flags. We're not going to hesitate to rebrandish them in order to defend the Israeli democracy and the courts. My whole life, I saw in the Declaration of Independence a reflection of the Israeli covenant to the definition of the things that are common. When I established the IDC, I saw in it a Zionist university. We are going to remain faithful to our way. We are going to tell the truth. And we call today to enact a basic law with one sentence, and I quote, "The Declaration of Independence in 1948 is a basic law. Let us vote only to parties who commit themselves to pass this law. If we want and if we demand it, it will be fulfilled." Today, I say today, we still haven't lost our hope. We didn't lose our hope to continue to be people free in their country.
Thank you very much, Professor Reichman, for a very clarifying and explanatory speech. Let us move over to the Herzliya Assessment. Usually this part is a kind of fun part of it. I can see Professor Melnick, who's been doing it, I think, since the very first conference. It's a real fun part of the conference. And so now I have the privilege to introduce Professor Avi Gandhi, who is the CEO and president of Geocartography, a knowledge group for research, various feasibility research studies. He is the president of various public opinion polls. He grew up in Beit Sharim, and he studied at the Hebrew University and then at the Minnesota University in Minneapolis. And there he also did his PhD. He created new theory, geocartography, that has actually dealt in research studies on the whole space around us and its analysis. I could have done all of that because I invented in 1968 the GIS. But everyone said Gewalt. I need a computer, unfortunately. Please, could someone help me here technically? Okay, now we can hear you. Thank you. We served, by the way, at the same committee at Tel Aviv University. I'm an emeritus professor there, and chapeau for what you did there. He was speaking to someone in the audience, saying it was an honor to get to meet him once again. We were asked to call it Israel 360, in other words, 360 degrees. That would be a across-the-board overview about the different topics that this conference did touch upon. So let us start with Josephus Flavius. I think it was over 1,900 years ago. They said there's no point fighting against the Jews, they'd kill themselves anyway. So the first Gewalt that I would like to call upon today is that, unfortunately, he was right. In 2018, for the very first time, I carried out my research study that I'm going to present today. In 2019, I was inspired once because I do all sorts of election polls, and I said, let's for once see what happens in the backdrop of the election. So I asked each of the respondents, I will read out the list of all the various parties and factions, and tell me, what do you feel towards them? Starting off with, I love it, and I sympathize for it, perhaps, and there I will neglect, or I don't, or I might even hate it, all the way through with those feelings. And the risk was, I love it, I hate it, 302, and then you can see 126% I hate it, 302% that I don't love it. So here we have 428% of hatred, as opposed to 255% of sympathy, empathy, love. So didn't Josephus Flavius, wasn't he right? So I think that this declaration, unfortunately, is not being belittled or losing its size. Do you remember how many people wanted to establish a political party? 48 actually were submitted for our election campaign. So here we can see who is empathized with more, the Likud, blue and white, etc. Gesher, headed by Orly Abukassis, is really loved. So we have 716% of people who hated it, as opposed to 381% who loved it. So yes, Josephus Flavius is screaming out to us, and that is a national Gewalt. That is the moment when we really need, instead of hating each other, to unify ourselves. At times of emergency, the Iranians are there, the Gazans are there, and all our enemies are around us. We have to learn to live together and unite. So just have a look, more or less. Shas is not liked, Tal, Hadash, Ramad, Balad, all the names of the various parties. Just want to remind you that our self-hatred very often rises and peaks, and sometimes we even kill. May I remind you the assassination of our Prime Minister Rabin. And here, this was beautifully done, this sculpture, and it just reminded me about our political backdrop, that sculpture. So I asked whether it would be worthwhile or not worthwhile to pass a law, which would be an election law, to do some kind of referendum that in most of the normal countries like the United States or France and others carry out, that there should be only 2 or 3 parties. Why should we have 14 or 15 that have been approved? That's already after all the others were shortlisted and narrowed down from 48. They felt that there weren't a sufficient amount, and that's what happened at the beginning of the elections. So 56% said, yes, we should pass a bill, 27% one shouldn't, and 17% basically abstained. They thought but perhaps not. But Gewalt, we really don't know how one can do that, but we ought to aspire towards that. That would create some kind of unity. Technically, we know how to do it. We'll just lift that threshold of the vote. One of the things that really is very troublesome in my eyes and troubles me is I flew to India 7 years ago, and I read the Times of India on my way there, and I read there that a research study was carried out in Asia, and it asked the citizens, had you been reborn, where would you have liked to have been reborn and lived? So I knew that I'd do the same here in Israel, so I did. I carried out that survey here, and I asked the citizens of Israel in a very big sample here, and I asked them that, had you been reborn, where would it have been, and where would you have lived? I did it a year ago, and before that, 34% not in Israel. I would have loved to have gone back and be reborn somewhere else. I think that that's terrible. And I then asked an open question, why don't you want to live in Israel? And what I got is, where would you have liked to live? The United States, Australia, Switzerland, Canada, Great Britain. And now I got 32%, which is more or less the same as the 34%, and that was in 2019. And these are the answers to the question of why. Well, first and foremost, 55% said that it was because of the cost of living in Israel. This, by the way, was reiterated in the three different times that I asked these questions. For those who don't know, 34%, 35% of the population of the State of Israel define themselves as vulnerably in a economic state, or even poor, belonging to the poverty cycle. So that says something. And then 15%, it was because of our security situation. Our children, God forbid, are being killed. And then because of our culture, our local culture, 13%. These three elements were reiterated, but 6 years ago, the security issue 6 years ago was number one, and then it was the economic situation, and the third thing was because we had become sort of thugs, basically. And so that was the answer when we talk about the culture. Now something else has been added, and that is, in other words, our vulgarity, racism, coercion on the religious side. Those were explanations, and they weren't happy with the government either. That was 8%. So I think that when we look at all this, then we need to now really launch a national campaign for the return of cultures. We've lost all those various cultures, for example, the culture of actually talking to each other in a family, actually on the road, academic culture. I'm a professor, but people don't understand that there's academic culture which enables people to ask every single question, but it does not allow every single professor to stand up on the podium in his classroom and express his opinion of the Prime Minister. So we have to, and we have to remember how people drive in this country as well, wild cats. So remember that and add that to your category of hatreds. And remember that before we actually do send the IDF out on a campaign, who will enable the government to be able to have a little more time to really deal with the really important issues, in other words, society, our economy and other things. That's very important. Now, the Arab population, of course, I had to go and carry out a survey there. And what I asked there, I asked under the inspiration of my Arab friends. And I do have Arab friends and partnerships with a specific kind of group of the Arabs. Some of them are Muslims, some of them are Christians. And they came to me one day and they said, Avi, you've got out a research center, Geocartography. Please carry out a research study. What would have happened had an Arab party, a new one, be incepted? One that would have engraved upon its banner two main things. One, to swap the leadership, the existing leadership, the political leadership, because it does not actually concern itself for the Arab population or anything that happens around us. It doesn't develop the actual localities, education, and it sure is not concerned about the fact that we're shooting each other, but it only interests the police, the Israeli police. It's if it's their top priority, but not the government's whatsoever. So we want to declare that we're loyal, we pledge our allegiance to the State of Israel, and we want equal rights, and we want to work for the sake of the Arab population in order to promote and foster and enhance our whatever we do have and where we live. And we're talking about Palestinians and Arab Israelis. And we said we want to be Arab Israelis and we want to be different from the Palestinians. And what we actually received in that survey was that 59% of them would have voted for this new faction had it been established. 2 years ago, it was 77%. So what is happening in the Arab sector is not simple whatsoever. We've got to solve this issue because they are a population that live amongst us, and we want them to be happy. We want them to have egalitarian rights, and their leadership will help us develop them, and that we should not only respect them and they should respect us and live together. So if anyone asked me, and they did this morning, they're always, in the media, people always ask us really vehement questions, and they asked me if these were my private opinions, and I said no, these aren't my private opinion, but I'm representing those who are willing to pledge allegiance to the State of Israel and will not raise the banner of the Muslims when we are fighting against that specific enemy. So this person who heads this new party, I had the honor of interviewing him before the last elections, and I sat with a group of people who were interviewing on the state radio for about 5 hours. And when Iman Odeh came and spoke, then the moderator asked him, he said he's moderate, welcome, and Odeh immediately jumped and said, I'm not moderate. So when I interviewed him, I said, Mr. Odeh, we hadn't met before, and I told him that I'd carried out the research and these are the results. Why don't you head such a party? And he said, allegiance is a story from the medieval times. Now what do we have? Yes, democracy, with its interpretation that in democracy one can do anything. But that's a problem. We need to help solve that problem as much as possible, creating equality for all the citizens of Israel, and to do so in a gentle manner. Now, what shall we do about in Gaza to create a ceasefire leading to a peace agreement? 48% said respond firmly right away with a military force. 31% said provide them with more social and financial support to the Gaza residents. By the way, it's incumbent upon us to do both at the right time and to the right measure. And no less than 21% have despaired from that path, and they said that there's absolutely no way of bringing peace with Gaza into reality. So yes, I think that the results and the outcomes really prove everything that we have said up to now. It's a very severe and grave situation, and whatever was said is very easy to agree with, that the situation is very grave. A few years ago, I wrote a brochure about Israel 2048, and I opened with the following. that we need to contribute to the future of Israel so that that will be a place that our children and grandchildren will want and will be proud to live there and choose to live in it. More than any other place in the world, we talk about values, society, economics, their vision, the planning, the development, real estate. But first and foremost, if this is what we are actually talking about, first and foremost is that there should be good, kind citizens with good relations between people, and that is more important even than the actual religion. So let us retain and safeguard that. Good evening to you all.
Thank you very much, Professor Degani.
לדעתי היינו צריכים להקשיב לפרופסור רייכמן לפני כמה שנים בקשר להמלצות שלו, בקשר לשינוי שיטת הבחירות וחוקה לישראל. יכול להיות שהיינו מקבלים ציונים יותר גבוהים פה על הלוח. וכעת יש לי את העונג להציג את פרופסור רפי מלניק. הוא פרופסור בבית הספר לכלכלה ובבית הספר לאודר לממשל דיפלומטיה ואסטרטגיה ב-IDC הרצליה. והוא משנה לנשיא לעניינים אקדמיים לשעבר, שיושב בדיוק על יד הפרובוסט של היום. ובעצם פרופסור מלניק הוא בעל PhD בכלכלה מאוניברסיטת קליפורניה בברקלי. פרופסור מלניק כיהן כמשנה למנהל מחלקת המחקר בבנק ישראל, מרצה באוניברסיטה העברית ובאוניברסיטה העברית בירושלים, מרצה אורח גם באוניברסיטת BU ו-UC דייוויס, ומחקריו ופרסומיו עוסקים בתחומי הכלכלה המוניטרית, כלכלת ישראל ואקונומטריה יישומית. פרופסור מלניק פיתח את מדד מלניק לבחינת מצב המשק הישראלי. המדד מאבחן בזמן אמת את רמת הפעילות ואת התפניות בפעילות המשקית בישראל, ואני לא יכול שלא להזכיר כראש הבית ספר הבינלאומי שפרופסור מלניק עלה לארץ מצ'ילה, היה קיבוצניק ושירת ב-202 בחטיבה 35.
Thank you, Jonathan. Okay. ערב טוב, הכנס היה ארוך, אני אנסה להראות לכם עובדות על פי המסורת של ההרצאות שלי כאן, הנתונים הכי אמינים, הכי בדוקים של כלכלת ישראל, עם ניתוח שאני אציג לכם. אז יש אמרה שאומרת, אל תסתכל בקנקן, אלא במה שיש בו. אז באמת הקנקן נראה טוב, והוא באמת במצב לא רע, אבל בתוכו יש מספר אתגרים, שאם אנחנו לא נטפל בהם, הקנקן עלול להישבר, ואני רוצה להראות את שני הצדדים של התמונה. אלה הנתונים, האינדיקטורים הבסיסיים של כלכלת ישראל ב-2018. כלכלה צומחת ב3%, קצת מעל 3%, תוצר לנפש מעל 41,000 דולר, אין לנו בעיית אינפלציה, אבטלה מהנמוכות ביותר שהיה לנו בהיסטוריה, יש לנו שיעור תעסוקה גבוה מאוד, גם בהשוואה למדינות אירופאיות, ואני אחזור לנתון הזה כי הוא משמעותי לדברים שאני אומר בהמשך. עודף בחשבון השוטף של מאזן התשלומים, יש פה הרבה מאוד דולרים, עודפי דולרים בכלכלה. יש לנו גירעון טיפה גדול, כבר דובר על זה, ואני אחזור על הסוגיה הזאת, זה מאוד בעייתי.
I'm going to repeat this issue because it is problematic. We have a change of trend in the public debt going from a long-term decline. We started to see an increase there and analyze that. We have a problem of poverty and a problem of inequality. The greatest challenge that I wish to note here, and I referred to it in previous years, is that the policy that was carried out between the years 2003 to recent years was a policy that highly strengthened the resilience of Israel's economy, helping it to withstand any external influences. You can see that
period of time of the great financial crunch in 2009. In the United States, we see the GDP dropping by 3%, the same in Europe and the entire world. But we keep growing, perhaps at a slower rate, but growth is positive. This is a resilience that we have acquired for ourselves vis-a-vis world economies, making sure we can withstand any external shocks that sometimes economies all around the world have to bear. We also see the resilience in our ability to withstand security occurrences that used to take Israel out of economic balance. You can see 2006, Lebanon war. If we didn't know that war occurred there, then we could not have figured it out from this data. The market kept growing, economy recovered, despite the fact that the entire northern area was not active. The various Gaza operations did not interfere with the growth of the economy. This is a resilience that we have acquired. It is a national asset, an exceptional national asset. Now, what is happening later on? Why did we have this resilience of withstanding the big financial crisis, world financial crisis in 2007 and 2008? The economy grew rapidly. We had a reliable and conservative fiscal policy. The budget was balanced. We saw a decline in debt ratio to GDP. We had the ability to exercise a very broad monetary policy because interest rates were high and everything seemed open for the Bank of Israel to do whatever they need to do. When there is a crisis, inflation was low. We had a monetary policy of a flexible inflation rate, surplus in current account, and a financial public sector. What's happening now? What's happening if we need to withstand some new external shock? The economy is no longer growing according to its potential, and I will show you in a minute. We don't have a reliable fiscal policy. The government lost hold of the budget. The deficit it created on the side of expenditure and income exceeds what should have happened. We don't have a balanced budget, and the trend of deficit relative to debt relative to product is on the decline, and we don't have any monetary ammunition. So if anything comes from the outside, our interest is borderline zero, and we have no ability of handling it. In other monetary aspects, we are fine. What are the challenges that we see within the picture? I want to talk about productivity and growth. I want to talk about fiscal policy, deficit and debt, the cost of living, poverty and inequality, and all of that in the 10 minutes I have left.
קצת זהויות בסיסיות. התוצר גדל משני מרכיבים, גידול בפריון וגידול בכוח העבודה. בשנים האחרונות רוב הצמיחה של המשק נבע מגידול תעסוקה ולא מפריון.
This is a statistical fact that is measurable. The growth in labor force has to do with the growth in population plus the rate of involvement. This increased labor input growth, and we reached a situation where labor input and employment reached the heights as we see in Europe, and we don't expect any additional increase. What does that mean? Without a real improvement in the rate of productivity, the rate of growth of our economy will be just close to the rate of population growth. It will not exceed it. And this is not enough in order to close the gap vis-a-vis countries we wish to align ourselves with. This is productivity in Israel. What I'm showing you here is GDP per hour in Israel. That's the red graph compared to other countries which are listed here that we want to align. A very large gap, a gap that is growing bigger and bigger, and if we don't close the gap, we will not be able to improve the quality of life in Israel. At the Aharon Institute here in the IDC, we try to explain the sources of the productivity gap, and we see that 60% of the explanation stem from
נמוך מדי במדינת ישראל. אין לנו מספיק מלאי הון. גם במונחים של תשתיות פיזיות, בעיקר תשתיות תחבורה, וגם מכונות וציוד והשקעות בסקטור הפרטי. קצת נובע גם מההון האנושי, ההון האנושי שמצטרף לכוח האדם, הגידול בשיעורי השתתפות, בעיקר של חרדים ושל ערבים, הוא כזה שלא מביא את המיומנויות הדרושות לכלכלה מודרנית. ולכן התוצר גדל שזה מצוין, אבל אין לנו פריון, אין לנו את התוספת הזאת שאנחנו כולנו מצפים. כאן אתם רואים את שיעור התעסוקה, שיעור התעסוקה גדל מאוד, אבל הוא לא יכול לגדול יותר. ולכן אנחנו לא נוכל להמשיך לצמוח בקצבים שצמחנו בשנים האחרונות, שכאמור לא ניצלו את פוטנציאל כושר הצמיחה שלנו. ואתם רואים מה מצפה לנו? מצפה לנו החץ התחתון, החץ בצד ימין, שזה ירידה של שיעורי הצמיחה במדינת ישראל. כל התחזיות למשק הישראלי מדברים על זה שגם של ה-IMF, גם של ה-OECD, גם של בנק ישראל, ששיעורי הצמיחה של ישראל ייבלמו בשנים האחרונות. זה מה שקורה לשיעורי הצמיחה לנפש שלנו מול מדינות הסמן. אתם רואים שבמקום שאנחנו נהיה במגמה של סגירת פער, שאנחנו נגדל בשיעורי צמיחה שעוזרים לנו להגיע למצב של המדינות האירופיות האלה שאנחנו רוצים להידמות להם, אנחנו הולכים ומתרחקים. אנחנו לא מתקרבים אליהם, וזאת בעיה, זה אתגר גדול מאוד שאנחנו חייבים לטפל. מדיניות פיסקלית וגירעון. אתם רואים שבשנת 95 ואפילו בשנת 2000 האמירה שהסקטור הציבורי זה השמן והרזה, זה נכון, אבל השמן עשה דיאטה מאוד מאוד רצינית. ואנחנו רואים שההוצאות של הממשלה ירדו, אפילו ירדו מעבר למה שרצוי, יש כאלה שטוענים. בזמן האחרון, בשנתיים האחרונות, אנחנו רואים תפנית כזאת. והתפנית הזאת הייתה יכולה להיות מבורכת, אם זה היה תוצאה של איזושהי תוכנית כלכלית מוסברת, מובנת, שעלולה או עשויה להביא אותנו לשיפור בתשתיות, לשיפור במצב של הבריאות שנדון פה, בחינוך וכל זה. זה לא המצב. ההוצאות הולכות לדברים שהם לא יביאו שום תועלת ממשית לכלכלה הישראלית. שימו לב לגירעון. הגירעון היום מגיע, אני חושב שזה כבר אומדן חסר, כשעשיתי את המצגת, לא היה לי את הנתונים המעודכנים, אני חושב שאנחנו כבר עוברים את 4% תוצר, ואין רע בגידול הגירעון כאשר זה מתבקש. אתם רואים שב-2008-2009, כאשר המשק נכנס להאטה מסוימת, המייצבים האוטומטיים יצרו גירעון, וזה בסדר, משום שאחרי שאתה יוצא מהשפל, אתה מאזן את התקציב. אנחנו היום נמצאים בתעסוקה מלאה, ובתעסוקה מלאה הגירעון חייב להיות נמוך. הגירעון הזה שאנחנו רואים ב-2018 משקף גירעון מבני שאנחנו נצטרך לטפל בו, גם בצד ההוצאות וגם בצד ההכנסות. וזה דבר שהמשק לא זקוק לו כרגע, כי שני הצעדים האלה עשויים או עלולים להאט עוד יותר את כלכלת ישראל. זה הסיפור של החוב. המגמה של ירידת החוב יחסית לתוצר הייתה מגמה יוצאת מן הכלל שהעניקה לנו את החוסן, אבל כבר ב-2018 וגם ב-2019 בוודאי ביתר שאת אנחנו רואים שינוי כיוון, וזה דבר שצריך להדליק מנורות, משום אפשר לעשות גידול בחוב במידה ואנחנו עושים פרויקט של תשתית, למשל אם היינו עושים מטרו בגוש דן וכתוצאה מזה הממשלה הייתה לוקחת הלוואות לעשות את המטרו הזה, היה מוצדק, אף אחד לא היה בטענות לגידול החוב. תשתיות. שימו לב, שיעור ההשקעה בתשתיות ממשלתיות יחסית לתוצר. ופה אני הבאתי באמת פרספקטיבה ארוכת טווח, משום שתשתיות לא נותנות את הביטוי שלהם בטווח הקצר. החץ שאני מראה שם, זאת הירידה בהשקעה בתשתית במה שקרוי בישראל העשור האבוד. זה העשור שבין מלחמת יום הכיפורים ותוכנית הייצוב של 1985. אין לובי לתשתיות,
There is no lobby for infrastructure. The government was under pressure, a lot of expenditure for security, and they had to cut back, and they did it in infrastructure. What's the problem? It never recuperated. Instead of the investment in infrastructure become 4% of product, we are now around 2% only. And this makes all the difference in the world. If we double the amount of investment in infrastructure, perhaps we'll be able to successfully deal with the horrible transportation problems we have in Israel and other problems of that time. Cost of living, I'll talk about the main point because we've heard from Professor Degani that this is a very grave problem and the young generation is always complaining about it. And I'd like to focus on the most problematic aspect, and this is the cost of living and housing. What happened since the Ministry of Finance began its program in last year? Instead of stabilizing those beginning of construction at a rate that will assist the demand, we see that we are on a decline of construction. Something happened here. Government policy, instead of encouraging supply, it decreased its supply, and in upcoming years we will probably see this pressure of prices going back to rise instead because of shortage in housing. In order to meet the demand, the beginning of construction have to be between 50 to 55,000 units. Inequality and poverty. We see that poverty in Israel is on the decline. The red line is the poverty that the economy creates before intervention, and the yellow one is after taxes and payments. It looks okay. Is this enough? The answer is no, because when we compare the poverty to OECD countries, we are leading there, and this is very bad, and we cannot afford it. Inequality, same thing happens here. Something good is happening for inequality that is created by economy, but still when we look at the result, we are further away from reaching a satisfying situation. We see that the policy of welfare is less effective than it used to be in the past. These two graphs show the percentage of decline of poverty and inequality prior to intervention and after intervention. You can see that in recent years it is very, very low compared to what we have seen in previous years. Last point, we saw the cut in government expenditure, and this is also expressed in the public consumption. Some of it is the drop in security, but we also see a drop in other components. And the red graph is the civil consumption or private consumption. What we see here is that the government cut on the supply of services, public services, education and such. Now the private sector, if they can supply it for themselves, they do, and if not, they stay behind. We have a problem. This policy has to change. In conclusion, if we do not come back with a real program for economy for improving productivity, we will stay stuck. We have to go back to the fiscal policy which is reliable. We have to take care of the deficit and expenditure. There is room for deficit if there is a national project of infrastructure. There's no room for deficit if we have an unplanned expenditure. Without rehabilitating the physical infrastructure, we're not going to have any improvement in productivity, and we will not be able to close the gaps vis-à-vis the Western countries. As for the cost of living, if there's no change in government policy where the single purpose must be to increase supply and no other plan, then we might go back to a positive, or not positive, says the speaker, but rather an increase in prices for housing. And ultimately, the policy of handling poverty and inequality which was based on the trickle-down approach, which means let's take care of the macro economy, and this is going to trickle downwards. It is working, but it's working at the rate and the amount which is too slow and too few, and we have to have a national plan for handling these issues. The plan doesn't have to be a universal sort of a plan, because the two groups of populations which contribute or are represented in a non-proportional manner in poverty and inequality are the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab population, and so we need specific plans for these two sectors in the population in order to handle poverty and inequality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Melnick. Although it is somewhat depressing, let us try and recover from it. Now it's a pleasure for me to introduce Major General Amos Gilead, the Executive Director of the Institute for Policy and Strategy and the Chairman of the Herzliya Conference series. He is definitely a breath of fresh air on this campus. And as we saw throughout the conference, there were key figures roaming around here that Amos has met over the years in various scenarios. We don't know how and where. Perhaps in 20 years' time we will discover exactly how. And I would like to congratulate Professor Reichman, who know how to bring someone like you, Major General Amos Gilead, because the landscape here is definitely unique. We can see all the people who work with you here at the Herzliya Conference, how you've consolidated them all and how they all respect you. And you seem never to raise your voice or lose your temper. A Zionism of the days of yore, and it's simply a pleasure to work with you. So let them be many more people like you at the IDC. So let's hear a round of applause, please. Because this conference, it ticked exactly as it ought to have done, and they kept to the timetable 90% of the time, with such charm and etiquette and culture of discourse. The Zionism of the days of yore.
Amos Gilead, the floor is yours.
Hey, good evening. Well, after such words, please could you repeat them at my eulogy? What Professor Reichman also said at the opening. So thank you very much to my team. I intended to do a Herzliya assessment, and I am a nut to keep. I really like keeping to the timetable, and we did, all in all. That in itself is important. So what I'm going to do instead is share with you the main assessments that ought to emanate from this conference, and of course they will actually in a written form in different way after various discussions and analyses. So these are the main issues, the good news and the bad news, and what needs to be done. Iran is the central threat. Now, why is it the central threat, the main one? And it isn't clear to each and everyone. Their ideology is to eradicate Israel from the map. In our culture, sometimes I hear, so what? If they say it, they don't really mean it. Well, they do mean it. They not only mean it, but they're preparing a plan. In contrast to the darker chapters of our history, and Lieutenant General Gadi Eisenkot will speak to us in a moment about that and about our history. We've never been helpless, and so therefore we have to be determined to persevere and ensure that Iran will never have nuclear weaponry. First of all, because if they do have it, they will decide based on various sort of divine decrees when to use it, and therefore never denigrate their intention to do so. And of course, the question is, I don't want them to have that capability. It's easy to say, hard to achieve. What we need is a determined intelligence force.
Also, at present, based on the JCPOA that all of us hate, at least it did curb that project. Now, America is obstinately trying to stop that nuclear project, but if they don't find a way of bringing about actually a toppling of that regime, even with the wielding of tremendous pressure, they will go back to enhancing their project because they want to reach a situation wherein they will be able to do that quantum leap to that kind of nuclear warhead to the level of 1.94 to 2 meters. That is their program. That is what I've learned from the archives that our Mossad brought and from previous intel information. And that is their covert plan, nuclear plan. Now, the only way to prevent that, whenever we can, is to negate that capability from their hands. So if you have an evil mind with no muscles, then it's not worth anything, is it? Number two, if they do have nuclear weapons based on watching out and observing them very closely for many years, and with my ties with Arab countries, I do not think for one moment that the Arab countries will ever agree that Iran will have nuclear weapons if they don't have it. If that reality does take place, and God forbid Iran will have it in their hands, the certain Arab countries will also develop nuclear weapons. And this something is completely overt that Saudi Arabia has connected with Pakistan, and actually on the day of judgment, they will receive what they need. China has sold to Saudi Arabia missiles that are known well without a nuclear warhead, but they actually do have capabilities. So if I'm talking about biblical images, Samson after visiting the barber. In other words, Samson without his muscles. There's nothing else that should frighten us so much. If Iran has nuclear weaponry, they will frighten us, and together with the media here, we will be in a state of panic and hysteria. Iran has a plan to build Lebanon up as Hezbollah. In other words, we will have that northern threat, and with our extraordinary achievements that the previous chief of staff led us to, and they've built tunnels. I mean, it's brilliant. Nasrallah said, "We will conquer the Galilee," and lots of people laughed at him, and so he actually invested pots of money in order to actually tunnel those tunnels underground. And God forbid if they succeed. This is one of the greatest threats, thanks to our deterrence as well, but the destruction of those tunnels without shooting one shot that the Hezbollah succeeded in doing. So if they also want to launch those missiles, they didn't succeed. So now let us build up Syria as a second proxy of Iran. The execution was curbed, I think, to a 70 or 80% destruction of it, and I'm not sure if we will succeed in convincing Iran to abandon those activities, their hostile activities against Israel. They're infusing tons of money. Iran hasn't got any money, and yet they're continuing. And what else is happening in the Gulf? The superpower, the United States, with a $700 billion security budget and such power of their air force and their technologies. I mean, there are a few people who know it very well here in the audience, but the Iranian impression is that the United States doesn't want to topple the regime, but just prevent the nuclear weaponry. So Iran will actually develop their infrastructure and wait to see what happens in the United States, because the advantage of Trump is that no one knows exactly what he's going to do, and so they're waiting quietly in the sidelines to see what happens. The United States and are watching to see if there are any violent activities on the part of Iran. I won't enumerate all sorts of things that are happening in Yemen and blowing up the various gas tanks, etc. They could possibly do that against us, and ultimately there is the second contingency plan, and that things might lose control, and then of course America will take military steps against them. You can't plan everything in the Middle East, and that is moments of scenarios of crisis. We have
have immense systems. We've got technologies, Air Force, the supremacy of it. Mickey Federman is here, the Elbit owner, one of the most leading in the industrial industry as well. And they are supplying us brain and muscles. And we've also got missile defense systems, don't forget. Now I'd like to keep to the timetable, and that is the Palestinian issue. In contrast to what was said, the good news is that we have developed, especially the security forces, first-class ties with the Arab countries. It's nearly a strategic partnership, but I do not agree that we will actually receive any kind of peace that will overtake the Palestinians. I do not agree with anyone who said that, because, yes, the Arab countries are fed up perhaps with the Palestinians, but they will not betray them, because that actually endangers themselves. So the intel has failed all over the world, including here, and that is to forecast what will happen, the stability of the Arab world. And I hope that I am erring here, but on contrast to what we have heard, they will not normalize the ties. What does it matter if they will or not? Because it's like having a tree with one root. In other words, a political hurricane could blow it over. Do you want examples? Iran is such a great enemy. Turkey, we're not quite sure about, between a friend and a foe. So we had negotiations with Arafat, the biggest murderer of all. And I, by the way, objected to it when I even subjected my report on that, because, of course, he wanted to get rid of us here, and we will find ourselves in a state of violence. That was my assessment at the time, and unfortunately, that is what happened. We spoke to him, and with Abu Mazen, we're not talking, and he says he's objecting to terror. But he is coordinating with us, so why are we cutting back on his budget? Why is that? Because of politics. On the other hand, we, against the Hamas, this description that we are sending money over to them is somewhat demagogical. But with Hamas, we can either have some kind of settlement, or we'll find ourselves occupying. So let us get rid of the Hamas. People have said, we've done that. So what happened? So who will take control of 2 million people? Who will manage them? I am saying to you, as someone who is responsible as the coordinator and the liaison officer in the territories, it'll be the IDF. They're the only entity that can possibly manage them. I don't want us to do that. Instead of actually training their forces, they will have to be dealing with sewage issues and other things. The greatest danger embedded in Hamas is they keep finding alternatives against Abu Mazen, and they keep saying the peace option has failed, so now we have terror and violence instead. Do you know how many terror incidents they're planning that have been thwarted by the IDF? Enough one suicide attack. It means a bus blowing up. So therefore the thought has to be, the way of thinking has to be strategic. If the politicians want to tell the IDF to destroy Hamas, they better think twice, and it's very frustrating. So I think that the Palestinian issue, there are all sorts of lights and shadows. The lights are our special ties with the Arab countries, the shadows being that this is not a deeply rooted tree. That's the second message. The third message that I wanted to convey to you is the United States is extremely important to us, and our security ties and our strategic ties, they are our main pillar in our national security. We cannot imagine it without it, but there are a plethora of things that we need to actually plan in accordance how we actually structure the ties with them. For example, if Professor Melnick, everything that he presented here, it's really frightening. If we suddenly find ourselves in a quagmire of a deficit, then you can't rely on just on aid from the United States that will increase, even if President Trump is our greatest friend of all. I'd also like to express my concern, and that was discussed also in the workshops, about the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. They give us a strategic depth, but it's a very very delicate situation, and we have to do our utmost to retain and stabilize that situation. We do not want bloodshed, and it's a lot of money if anything changes and a lot of risk, because therefore we want to retain our special ties with Egypt as well. There's definitely, we're distant from normalization. The Chief of Staff in his uniform has never ever landed on the land of Egypt and been welcomed there officially. And the same, of course, with our naval commander or our Air Force commanders. It's not a matter of ceremonies and pomp and ceremony. That's not the issue. It has to be openly. If they're hidden behind the scenes covertly for 40 years, that's a message, isn't it? And by the way, they did meet actually officially in Washington a number of times, but that's not the same. We've got a fantastic tie with Egypt, with Cyprus, and I won't go into detail about it because time is of the essence, but that is a very important asset for all of us. There are certain things that I wanted to deliberate with you as well. This whole conference is built on two pillars. First of all, that's our national security, Iran and the Lebanese and Syrian fronts. That is very similar to a house with very strong walls, but thanks to our Air Force and the quality of the command and the army and our intel forces, we do have those strong walls. But what I fear is national resilience, because termites are undermining that force and that clout. It will not actually be retained, and we've put so much. But after we spoke about a collapsing health system, corruption, and the various indices that Professor Melnick and Degani presented about our economy. But these are things that will hit out at us, and therefore we have to voice opinions on that. It's very easy to have a national security actual conference. That's easy, but it is the social resilience and national resilience that are important, because without that we won't have national security. And therefore from this conference we ought to underpin, and we did so during the days of the conference, we have to actually cover all those aspects that are the most salient, because they support all the other things. If we're talking about the various rifts of society, the health system, and the various indices that were presented just before I spoke. Just to summarize and wrap up, because I'd like to keep to the timetable, I think that our security situation is one of the most excellent that we have ever actually had in our times. But unfortunately there are some very dark clouds, and in contrast to what we can do with the weather, those clouds we can grapple with. And in the 20 seconds left, I would like to thank this amazing production team, and of course the team that was behind the scenes, because they truly were far and beyond my expectations. And there were some very senior officials that came. There was an encounter basically of the other seniors from the American administration, and I won't enumerate everything, but there were also economic and other sessions here. So thank you very much for your patience and for your attention.
Now I'd like to invite the former Chief of IDF General Staff, Lieutenant
דו-שיח, שאני בטוח שהוא יהיה מרתק. הבינתחומי מעניק, כמו שאמר פרופסור רייכמן, אני רוצה לחזור, דוקטור כבוד, זה תעודת הוקרה. אני אומר שאין אדם שראוי, כמובן, במערכת הביטחונית יותר ממנו על תרומתו.
He is definitely worthy for his contribution, very broad contribution, and I can tell you that the IDF Chief of Staff is not someone who marches in front of everybody, but he managed to focus the system and make the proper prioritization. I talked about the tunnels. This was his determination, including some internal insistence. And the attacks in Syria, it's a result of the leadership. Special relationship with the United States would have not happened. And I think he is definitely worthy of such recognition of exceptional leadership. So, Major General in Reserves, Gadi Eisenkot, the floor is yours.